Hello everyone, and again Simchat Purim. There are many people suggesting that the Judaism of antiquity has no connection with the Judaism of contemporary times, that our texts of the past are totally irrelevant today without any significance. I would like to share with you some thoughts about chapter 3 of the book of Esther as a way of contradicting those who find no connection. Chapter 3 of the book of Esther, to me, is the most disturbing chapter in the entire book. It's the one chapter where I see little satire and little cause for joy, except of course today drowning out the name of Haman. In chapter 3 we are introduced to this character known as Haman, and the chapter begins simply by telling us how the king promoted Haman to second in command. We know nothing about the reason for his ascension. We understand that he has this insatiable lust for power, something made evident by the story itself, but we know nothing about Haman, nothing about his background, nothing about his accomplishments. All we know that he was appointed, but that he is very powerful and people are fearful of him. That notion is explained at the outset. All the king's courtiers in the palace knelt and bowed low to Haman. They all paid obeisance to this man who clearly was distinguished from every other leader within the kingdom except for the king. He was one who was feared. We learn nothing about the king being feared. We learn that the king was an alcoholic and liked to party. But about Haman, we learn how he is feared, to the point where everybody bows down to him except Mordechai. And we are introduced to Mordechai earlier on. We know that Mordechai was one who was part of the exile from Jerusalem, and Mordechai is one of the prominent figures within the Jewish community of Persia. But we learn here how Mordechai refused to bow down to him. Now, there are many books written, particularly children's books, describing the story of Purim, and in the illustrations about this section say Mordechai did not bow down to Haman because Jews only bow down to God. I will tell you that that's not true. We know from the beginning of the Bible, Abraham bows before the leader of the community with which he is going to undertake this transaction to buy a plot of land so that he can bury his wife. We learn later on there are several instances of Jewish leaders bowing and acknowledging the leadership of people. That is something that is apparent. It's written. So why was it that Mordechai refused to bow? There are lots of reasons given. Perhaps Mordechai felt that Haman was illegitimate. Perhaps Mordechai understood something about Haman the others did not. He was not afraid of him and believed that God would take care of whatever would transpire. But we know that Mordechai does not bow down to this man, and Haman, even though he wins the loyalty of everybody else, this one man refusing to bow down bothers him. You know, that's often the case with many of us when we in a position of leadership. 99 out of 100 people might accept a particular decision we make, but we often ignore those 99 and we focus on the one who didn't. We often focus on the one who doesn't like us, the one who objects to us, rather than focusing on the greater majority. But this was Haman. Haman was more concerned about the refusal of Mordechai, whether it was due to hubris, any other reason. Mordechai refuses to bow down, and Haman is incensed. Well, at this point, we are going to see a striking parallel between this story and one of the most barbaric eras of our history. And the parallel is kind of frightening. The king's courtiers who are in the palace gate know by now that Mordecai refuses to respect the authority of Haman. And they come to him and they say, "Why do you disobey the king's order?" I think they're less concerned about loyalty to the king than they are about the consequences. Using perhaps the vernacular, I could see them saying to him, "You're going to get us," to Mordecai, "You're going to get us all into trouble." That's really what's happening. You're going to get us all into trouble. We see that Mordecai represents not just one person, but Mordecai might be a symbol of defiance. And if he refuses, even those who remain loyal to Haman are going to get into trouble as well. So we see that this one individual has so much power, intimidating everybody else, so that when one Mordecai refuses to obey, everybody is afraid of what will now transpire. I think about the dilemma that many Jews had during the Holocaust, Jews living in the ghettos, when there was a decision to escape, to flee from the ghetto, knowing that their flight, once discovered by the Nazis and their henchmen, would lead to vengeance taken out against the rest of the community. This was a very difficult decision that the Jews had to make, resistance leaders had to make. It was important for them to survive, and therefore those who could fled from the ghettos, knowing that the people remaining would perhaps bear the consequences. And there were some within the Jewish community who did argue that you can't leave, because if you leave and you escape, the rest of us are going to suffer. Anyway, it's somewhat of a striking parallel. But at this point, Mordecai is intransigent, and all of the other officials, the king's courtiers, day after day tried to convince Mordecai to pay respect to Haman. When he refused to do so, they tattled on him. They were unwilling to stand with Mordecai in defiance. They were more concerned about saving their own skins. And so therefore, they not only complied with the king's ruling, but they went to Haman and they tattled on Mordecai, probably in large part as a way of convincing Haman that they were all loyal, and that if Haman wants to take revenge on Mordecai, do so on him, but not on us, because we are your loyal subjects. It's again this lack of temerity, lack of any kind of sense of social justice, lack of courage. They were all concerned about their own lives rather than the greater good of the community. And so at this particular point, we might assume that Haman would exact revenge against Mordecai, but he doesn't. What does he do? He has discovered that Mordecai is a Jew, and so rather than taking revenge against Mordecai exclusively, Haman holds the entire Jewish community accountable for Mordecai's one act of defiance. Again, perhaps parallels to Nazi Germany and the fact that Adolf Hitler, for whatever personal offense might have taken place in the past, exacts vengeance against an entire community. And this theme and this parallel is going to be developed in the further verses. Haman approaches the king and he argues, and I'm going to read the language, I'm going to read the words. This is his way of convincing the king that action needs to be taken out against the entire people rather than exclusively against one individual. Haman's words to the king. There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws, and it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. What is Haman essentially saying? These Jews are different, they are peculiar, they stand out in defiance. He lies because there is nothing at all to suggest that the Jewish community is disloyal to the king. But Haman highlights their peculiarities, their idiosyncrasies, their differences. They are different. Sound familiar? We Jews have been called out for our differences, so much so that there have been times in Jewish history when the Jewish community took measures to try to police the rest of the Jewish community to be making sure that every Jew not only complies with the rules, but that they shouldn't stand out. I remember years ago when I lived in Florida, I was visiting the hospital, and I as I generally did, I wore kippah, yarmulke on my head, and I ran into the mother of, or actually the wife of someone who was a patient there. I would visit people. There were a lot of snowbirds in Florida, so I would regularly visit every Jewish person in the hospital. There was one snowbird who had been hospitalized. I ran into his wife, and while we were in the elevator, she commented about my yarmulke, and she said, we should not stand out. We shouldn't call special attention to ourselves. That's the kind of fear that engulfs Jews even today. And there was at some point when Jewish community developed these laws called the sumptuary laws, commanding Jews not to stand out in dress, not to be too ostentatious, not to overly indulge in jewelry, so that Jews would not stand out from other people. Clearly, during the Holocaust, many Jews did stood out in terms of their dress, in their appearance, and their personality. This idea of being different has always been a subject of contention, and we Jews have been afraid of acting differently precisely because we know what the consequences of difference can mean. Here, Haman calls attention to this difference. The Jews are scattered, they're dispersed, they are different. And then goes on, embellishes and lies by saying they're also disloyal, which we know was not the case. And at this point, Haman argues for their destruction. And his ultimate weapon is not the difference, distinguishing between Jews and the rest of the empire, but rather he ultimately reverts to bribery, saying, and you know what? They're not only different, but if you get rid of them, I'm going to put money in your treasury. And that ultimately, I think, is what convinces the king. There are no pangs of conscience about bringing destruction upon loyal subjects within his empire. He is willing to sell himself and community simply for the sake of money. He acts blindly, and think about how many people followed Hitler simply because Hitler proclaimed that the Jews were different and they don't deserve to receive the same honor that is bestowed upon everybody else. In this particular case, Haman takes it further by bribing the king, and the entire future of the Jewish community perhaps is determined by money, by providing money. And remember, this is a king who is, we see as being wealthy. His kingdom is filled with so much materialism. Where is there any poverty? And yet he is willing to sell out a community simply for the sake of money. And we know that there were too many people during World War II who were willing to sell out Jews, were willing to kill Jews, willing to comply with the destruction of European Jewry. Not because they were necessarily different, but because they listened to the words of a leader and others who argued the Jews are different, we need to get rid of them, and people acting out of their own self-interests were willing to sacrifice the Jews within their communities to save their own hides. And so this is what happens. The parallels are striking. The fact that the Jewish community is threatened with extinction simply because a person proclaims that they are different. I am just going to point out one final bit of information here, which might not always be appreciated so well, even after all of this happens. And an edict, again, is proclaimed throughout the entire community that the Jews are doomed to destruction. The very, very last verse, we learn that as this edict was promulgated and distributed throughout the kingdom, the people of Shushan were perplexed, confounded, dismayed. The very last statement in chapter 3 highlights how the people of Persia, once they received this edict, were perplexed and confounded. What it suggests to us is that despite Haman's wishes, and despite the king's compliance, and despite the edict which was distributed throughout the kingdom, the people of Shushan were perplexed, were confused. They lived peacefully with the Jewish community. Why should the Jews be doomed to destruction? And if there is any kind of consolation in this chapter, a chapter which offers striking parallels between the Haman story and the story in more recent times, the only positive element of consolation is the fact that the people of Persia did not bear any hatred to the Jews, and their reaction was not like the reaction of so many in Nazi Germany and Eastern Europe to comply with Hitler's orders. But the first reaction of the Persian community was to say, why are they doing this? What is this about? We respect the Jewish community. We live with the Jewish community. So if nothing else, at least we find that the community of Persia did not express this kind of anti-Semitism that was introduced by Haman. And maybe that will be a source of consolation to carry us through some of the later chapters. Simchat Purim.